I'm Dr. Robin Williams, and for today's tour, we're going to analyze Broughton Street here in Savannah as a representative example of commercial main streets or high streets and the evolution of retail architecture. We're going to take a close look at how stores were designed to attract customers and how these stores kept adapting themselves as consumer demands and building technology changed through time. So join me as we take a stroll down Savannah's Broughton Street. Behind me on the opposite corner of this intersection of West Broughton Street and Montgomery Street stands a pair of houses that in the early 1900s were converted into stores. And I'm starting here because this illustrates how many commercial districts evolved out of other areas, be they industrial or residential, and how the buildings, the commercial buildings, many are purpose-built, but these were converted houses, mid-19th century houses. And you can tell they were houses by the window spacing on the facade facing Broughton Street compared to the buildings beyond them down the block. So if we look at the window spacing on this pair of houses, you can see that the outer windows are farther apart from the inner pairs of windows. And the outer windows corresponded to the side halls in each of those houses that were reflecting plans, and they would have had staircases coming up to an elevated first floor that corresponds basically to the upper part of the glass facade right now. But these are a pair of Savannah elevated townhouses, and at some point their value as real estate for commerce was far more important than their use as houses. From this side of the building, one can see the outline of the original house. So there's a clear dividing line just about here where the downspout is. You can see a change in the brick color. And from here you can see that the two pairs of windows hiding behind those palmetto trees are symmetrical relative to each other in that original area. And that everything to the left at this point was an addition when the building, presumably when the building became a commercial building. And we can see above that dark awning to the far left a little bit of vestige of a commercial sign, something that we're going to talk a lot about as we analyze Broughton Street. The stores in the bottom part of those houses we were just analyzing illustrate several of the techniques that commercial architecture uses to attract people in. One of the most important is the enormous scale of the plate glass windows. So in the early 19th century, a typical window would be roughly the size of a typical book, not much more than a foot square. And over the course of the 19th century, glass technology got, come on in, we'll look at this a little closer. Glass technology got better and better to the point where the windows here could be, using me for scale, you can just see how big these windows are. And a window roughly 10 feet square was only possible towards the end of the 19th century. And we call this plate glass. Another technique used by these stores is to frame those huge sheets of plate glass with a new structural material that was introduced in the 19th century called cast iron. And cast iron was able to achieve the structural strength of brick or stone with much less material, which meant there was more room for glass. So how do you know it's cast iron? Well, it helps if you have a magnet. Come close to iron and you have a handy magnet in your pocket, it will stick. Another common commercial feature of this storefront here on Broughton Street is the canvas awning, which is on a metal frame that allows it to be retracted. Now awnings, which we'll see a lot of on this street, offer a few practical advantages. One is they help shade the display windows from the brightness of the sun so they can help control light. They become a surface on which some awnings provide a sense of advertising or promotion. And they also, of course, for those on those rainy days, can provide a little bit of protection to the shoppers. Above the awnings, all across the facade of this building, where the original first floor was, we can see another set of windows, some of which were operable, which corresponded to a mezzanine. A rare feature on Broughton Street, but common in some larger commercial districts, which means that there was on the inside of this store that there would have been a second floor of sorts. So as we go in towards this, what is currently a nail salon, you can imagine inside here, at the level of those windows that we can see across the way, inside, there would have been a second floor, almost like a loft in an apartment. And that's known as a mezzanine, and it provided extra retail space in some stores. Right next door, we see another example of a cast iron front. Now this one's a little more elaborate. It's painted black, so it might be difficult to see details, so we'll move in a moment to check it out and verify that it in fact is cast iron. But cast iron is a molded material, which means you take the molten iron and you pour it into a mold, and it will take whatever shape you give it. So one of the advantages of cast iron was it could be molded into elaborately decorated patterns and forms. Now, one of the things about these stores is that they have this recessed design, some of them do. And this is a classic commercial architecture feature. And so as I enter into this space, it's as if the building is giving me a hug, a welcoming embrace inside this recessed area here. Here we see another recessed entrance, in fact a little bigger than the last one we saw. And these recessed entrances not only provided a welcoming hug, but they also provided an opportunity for additional display space with the large plate glass display windows. So not only do you have the display windows facing the street proper, but we have this extra area over here on both sides that allowed the retailers to have even more room for showcasing their wares, which not only was meant to catch the attention of passers-by going up and down the sidewalk, but on times when the store is closed and people in the evening would do window shopping, or on Sundays when the store is otherwise closed traditionally, people going for a stroll could in fact inspect more of the merchandise even if the store was closed. So the idea of the recessed entrance and combined display window was a key factor, a key strategy, as it were, in selling goods in a traditional storefront. Inside this store, we can see another characteristic of commercial architecture, and that is the pressed metal ceiling, commonly called pressed tin, but it's actually sheet metal made of iron. And it's a cheap material that allowed shop owners to dress up their stores. And in this case, it's a relatively simple pressed metal ceiling, but these would have been made in a factory and shipped out, ordered through a catalog. It's basically a piece of sheet metal, roughly 4 by 8 feet, maybe 2 by 4 feet. They varied in size. And you'd order this from a catalog, as I mentioned, and they came in varying designs. And you could basically tack it to the ceiling and create the effect of an elaborately plastered ceiling, but far more affordable. And given that commercial architecture is all about earning money and saving money and making a profit, dressing up your store with a pressed metal ceiling was a key method of doing that. This store shows the evolution of metal facades as in the 20th century, aluminum would replace cast iron as an affordable, industrially produced window frame material, and its distinctive thin profile, modernistic simplicity, a decided advantage was it didn't need to be painted because aluminum doesn't rust. This shop front with the aluminum frames around their plate glass windows also shows another 20th century commercial material that was very commonly found in the entrances, the recessed entrances of these stores. And that is this material called terrazzo, which is little chips of stone, usually marble, often white, but they could use dark marble or other colors of marble, ground up into little chips and mixed in with a cement that was tinted. And so here we have little chips of white marble with sort of a magenta and a gold separately tinted sections, and separated by these little frames that you can see here that are like sockets. So it's like a kind of architectural cloisonne using this material to separate the floor into separate sections. And then it's pressed and polished, and it allows for these geometric designs that you can see. Decorating the entrance of the store next to that terrazzo entrance, we see this recessed entry area with tile work that gives the impression of an entrance mat or a welcome mat, following the kind of patterning you might find in bathrooms or kitchens of the time in the early 20th century. And here these tiles form a kind of basket weave pattern. The building behind me across the street nicely illustrates how buildings on commercial streets evolve through time to cater to changing tastes in retail design and advertising strategies. So for example, on the right facade facing Jefferson Street, we can see the painted on the building from the 19th century, the phrase Maxwell Brothers, which was recently revealed in a renovation of this building. And it reminds us of how buildings in the 19th century were covered in commercial signage all over the buildings. Now, on the front facade facing Broughton, we can see how the building was dressed up in the 1920s or 30s with this elaborate Art Deco ornament with the typical stylized classical forms and the chevron, zigzaggy, pointy details in between the windows and the stylized cornice. In fact, Savannah is not really rich in commercial Art Deco, which is a good barometer of how healthy a city's economic district was in the Great Depression. Other cities have much more Art Deco, so this is one of the best examples we have in Savannah, but certainly not the only one. On the first floor of that Art Deco facade that was added to the building that says Maxwell Brothers down the side was this other material, another new material that was an option for shop owners to attract attention. And that's this material called vitrolite, which is basically about 3/8 of an inch thick, and it's in glass, highly reflective, as you can see. Black was very popular, and it was affixed to the facade. As you can see, the thickness, and opaque glass that is infused with color. Highly reflective, that allows the idea of reflections, in fact, like on regular windows, attract the eye and make the facade even shinier. At the intersection of Barnard and Broughton in Savannah are a pair of buildings that illustrate the impact of the Historic District Review Board on adjudicating or evaluating proposals for changes to commercial architecture, as in the case of the McDonald's, or the introduction of new buildings, as in the case of the H&M. So with the McDonald's, that building, that early 20th century buff brick commercial building, had been vacant for decades. And that, of course, is one of the challenges of commercial districts, is how do you keep tenants coming in and out? And until McDonald's came along several years ago and requested, frankly, to change some minor changes to the building in order to allow it to be a viable use to them. And their principal request was to cut a hole in the side facade where Broughton Street is there. And there is a small takeout window, a very unusual feature for a McDonald's, that this was worth the price to get a tenant in there. And it's proven to be a really successful feature. Now, beside the McDonald's is H&M. And that's a new building that occupied a vacant site on Broughton, a site that was vacant for many, many years. It's almost like having a missing tooth. And so, just like a gap in the teeth, having an empty site on a street is not good for a commercial corridor. And so H&M proposed this design. Actually, their original proposal wasn't this design. It was a 4-story facade, and from the angle we're viewing it right now, we can see that the 4th floor is pushed back, and they're actually used for condos. And then the top of the facade, that area between the top of the facade and the 4th floor condos, is actually a terrace for them, invisible to most people down here on the street. But what it also did is it lowered the massing of the building, so the real height of the building is pushed back, and so the massing and the height of the facade is closer to the other buildings. Now, the other feature was the entrance. The entrance they originally proposed was flush with the facade, 1 story high, really indifferent, undramatic. And I said, look, this is going to be the landmark anchor building at the west end of Broughton Street. you need to make a gesture. And just like we had that welcoming hug idea, recessed entrance that we've already seen, I suggested to them that they add that to this facade and in fact make it monumental, make it 2 stories tall, like the Kresge Company originally was, that we'll be seeing later in the tour. And not only did they accept that proposal, along with one of the other board members to step down their facade, but they took advantage of it as a place to situate their H&M marketing logo in that recess, which I thought was brilliant. Some recessed entrances are actually incredible showstoppers, elaborately shaped and dramatic in effect, almost like a stage set. And a good example is one that's now for a store called the Awning Company. Recessed entrance here betrays its vintage going back to the Art Deco era, with the staggered profile of the low walls here and the windows and that bold arched form with strips of aluminum holding the panels in place. So some entrances on Broughton Street and in other commercial districts are actually a doorway to a second floor business. And there are lots of commercial ventures historically that would be happening on the second floor of buildings. Travel agents, lawyers' offices, maybe chiropractors, dentists, and these kind of enterprises that don't need big shop windows but benefit from the walking traffic of a commercial street would lay out a floor mat like this in tile to advertise their presence. And this is more common in big cities, but we have a few of them here in Savannah. This shop front nicely illustrates how changes have occurred if you look at the tile work in the recessed entrance, and then you look at the windows, which in this case, interestingly, are copper. You can see that the window framework, the little knee walls, and the tile work don't align whatsoever. And one suspects that the display windows have moved over time, and as needs have changed, there was no effort to change the tile work, which now is protected actually as an historic feature. And that stores become successions of change through time. The sidewalk in front of Urban Outfitters here on Broughton Street illustrates another feature that was quite common in commercial districts around North America. And that is you see this stone framework here in the sidewalk. Inside that stone framework originally was prismatic glass, a whole framework of glass. It survives in abundance in places like Soho in New York. Little round or square sections of glass, and we'll see some survivors a little later in the tour, that were set in an iron matrix and that would allow light to penetrate down into the basement, which was extended out from the building wall under the sidewalk. Another characteristic of commercial architecture is to have elaborate designs above the storefronts on the upper parts of the building that can attract the attention of passersby from farther away. So the taller of the 2 buildings you see in the middle of this frame nicely illustrates how patterned brickwork on the pilaster forms in between the windows, the arches above the 3rd floor, and above those some decorative corbelling. And the most distinctive feature is that stepped parapet, which in this case the parapet is accentuated by these little pylons with pointed tops. All of that very typical of the 19th century. To its left is a more modest and more modern early 20th century response to that tradition of a stepped parapet, and we can see some decorative inset panels. And it's in that tradition that the H&M building also provides a stepped parapet over the entrance. So behind me we see the vestiges of a vacant site. There used to be a building here. In fact, a little fragment of that building stands rusty in the background behind me and illustrates how sometimes little pieces of buildings are left behind. And beside it, we can see the black frame of the metal. And up at the top, we can see just how thin the cast iron metal is applied to the brick structure underneath. So let's check how this works. So here we are with our handy magnet, and I will try it on the facade, and sure enough, no surprise, it's very rusty. Of course it's metal. But how about that black area beside? Let's try that. Yes, indeed. Also, cast iron. Cast iron shop fronts weren't the only part of a commercial building that was cast iron. In fact, this shop front, Alexandra's gift shop, illustrates how the upper stories have a cast iron cornice, cast iron window lintels. The cornice above the store itself here is rusting. It should be repainted, but it illustrates how all of that is iron, presumably ordered from a catalog. In fact, the shop next door betrays the damage of when a shop, only the upper story survives intact. The second floor there had been stripped off when this site was modernized. This process can be seen with this upper facade, second floor facade, was scraped, and literally the lintels were broken off. And then the top of the store here is a reproduction matching this one on the left. One of the characteristics of a cast iron storefront is that the iron down in the bottom corner typically shows where it came from, the foundry that made it, and the city in which that foundry exists. So for example, this one here, once again we have cast iron, this one is from the Etna Iron Works in Chicago. And the one on the left we can see is from the Lombard Company in Augusta, Georgia. And in fact even includes a date, 1898. At this store at the corner of Barnard and Broughton, a store called Nourish, we can see how these sandstone piers have been exposed through some renovation that happened early in the 20th century. And according to Savannah's preservation laws, these features are considered historically significant, so they couldn't be altered. And they reveal, like I've seen before on this tour, this practice of putting commercial signage in the 19th century on every surface. So for example, as we come closer, we can see millinery and other services upstairs, and what appears to be Mathers, something cleaned to order with a little arrow. And then on this side, we see clothiers, and it's really hard to make out some of this. And then further up we have foreign and domestic. So J. Sampson, foreign and domestic. And this material is sandstone, a material very common on shop fronts in the 19th century, before any of these shiny materials of the 20th had made their appearance. Here on Broughton Street, just a few feet away from Broughton, in front of a store called the Salt Table, we can see a rare survivor of prismatic glass that is, in this case, little cubes of glass that would have amplified the light going into the basement. Now, as you can see with these ones, they are purple, and that comes from them being infused with manganese when they were created. It would have been clear at first, but these cubes, and you can see that they're solid glass, and they would have channeled light, amplified light into the basement that extended out onto the sidewalk. Now for these to be purple, and you see a few of them over here that are perfectly intact, but what happened is they added manganese into the recipe to enhance the optics of these, and over time the manganese turned purple as it reacted to UV light. So for these to be very deep purple suggests that they are very old. The Crest Building, now occupied by Gap, illustrates what happens when a business is successful. So this building originally was just the left half, is what started as Kress, which by the way is the predecessor of K-mart, which during the 20th century, later 20th century, they rebranded themselves. So Kress is a store that goes back to the 19th century and evolved and became K-mart. But with their success, this store on Broughton Street expanded to the right, and it's interesting that the expansion is basically identical to the original building, but there are clues. A clue to how the Crest Building was expanded is if you can see this pattern of single pilasters down the facade, like there and there and there, but in the middle they're doubled up, and that's where the original building, which is everything to the left here, was doubled and expanded, and the parapet was presumably rebuilt. But with a very keen eye, you can also see that the brickwork is a slightly more reddish color on the right than it is on the left. Now, a feature that we can also see on the Crest store that extends above the shop windows from the corner is what we call a canopy. It essentially functions the same way as the awnings that we saw earlier, but this one is architecturally permanent. It's anchored in with those tie rods, gave a further opportunity for advertising one's name. So the Crest canopy here is a permanent feature. It's historic, it's protected, just like the name up at the top, even though the store is now occupied by Gap. Across the street from Gap is Banana Republic, and their facade illustrates old cast iron that we can see on the right. But on the left, we have a much simpler design. Clearly not cast iron. It's a reproduction in wood made in about 20 years ago when this facade was restored. And it's sort of an interesting commentary because cast iron originally was what you might call poor man's stone. And now even cast iron's too expensive, so it's reproduced in wood. One of the realities of commercial streets like Broughton Street, of a main street, is the succession of stores that occupy buildings. So here we see Victoria's Secret is the current occupant of this building. But 80 to 100 years ago, there was a very different and famous earlier occupant whose legacy is left behind in the Terrazzo Pavement in the entrance. So if we pan to the right, we'll see Terrazzo Pavement in its Art Deco style with the Art Deco font that you can see here and the characteristic black and gold color scheme of the time. And we can even see that the black area has little chips of gold stone mixed in with the black stone, and the gold area has this predominantly gold area but with both black and gold and even some gray stones mixed in, giving it a very mottled appearance. And of course all this set within these brass frameworks, especially evident up in the name J.C. Penney. And you can see that the font of the lettering is very typical of Art Deco, as we'll see over here, like that the J and especially that C reveals in its typography the vintage from the 1920s or 30s. A recent restoration of the Blue Mercury store on Broughton Street revealed this 19th century commercial signage underneath later layers of shop fronts. And what's fun is how pristine it is. And so you can see yet another example of this tradition, as that Jacob's men's store was an earlier occupant of this building. The Savannah Bee Company store on Broughton near Whitaker is a great example of a local retailer that uses distinctive design features to attract attention. So not only does it take advantage of the traditional recessed entrance and the old tradition of signage that hangs out over the sidewalk, but it does so in a very innovative and distinctive way with the hexagonal honeybee motif that's not only in the sign, but is also in the doors. And of course, bees are stenciled all over the facade. And this has actually turned out to be one of the most successful businesses on Broughton Street. They have opened stores in other locations, in other cities. Savannah Bee is a great example of a highly successful local business. The Paris Market Building, originally called the Lions Block on the northeast corner of Whitaker and Broughton, is a great example of the extent of cast iron work that's not just on the storefronts but on the windows on these two facades, and illustrates the benefit of a prominent corner location. Now what's interesting is that the Lions Block originally extended beyond what we see as Paris Market to the gray and then the white building beyond. And in fact, on that white building and just at the end there, you can see the coining, the block technique, which matches the corner here at the near edge And it reminds us that this building originally had this design that spread over across all 4 facades. The Lions block originally extended 4 shops wide. So the Paris Market fills in the left-hand 2 shops, and that plaque that we see hovering in the middle that has this modern gray building wrapping around it shows how the right-hand half of the building changed over time. So the Joseph Closier store, this one right here, was modernized with these horizontal ribbon windows at some point in the probably after 1930, maybe even into the 1940s. And On Time Fashions there at the end retains some of its original features, but the cornice that we can see on the Paris Market up at the top there, up here, has been removed, and the window lintels have been simplified with their most decorative features that we can see over here, removed from the building. Meanwhile, the coining at the far right-hand end survives as the counterpart to the coining at the other end of the building. So this is a building that has undergone significant changes through time, lots of modernizations. In fact, the Paris Market looks as if nothing ever changed, but in fact, it was the subject of a major renovation and restoration work. And in fact, the stores down at the bottom are a reproduction. These are not cast iron, but are in fact reproduction wooden columns to evoke the original cast iron. This set of stores on the south side of Broughton Street, just east of Whitaker, illustrates how the facades have been essentially neutralized and made blank canvases, as it were, for signage and to become more modern and simplistic as the architectural taste moved away from ornament. And this process actually continued, and only in the early 20th century do we see facades being re-excavated. So this combination here, we can see a facade right here that's still blank, and this one largely blank. This set were also blank, but they were excavated, and we can see the end one still has vestiges of simplicity about it. Here on the south side of Broughton Street, right by Panera Bread, as we approach Bull Street, the central street that crosses Broughton, we can see that the sidewalk actually is very strange. It's got tar and this pattern of divisions, and every here and there you see these little patches, and when we get to the corner we'll see what's going on with the sidewalk. So here we have one of the largest expanses of prismatic glass. These are later ones than the purple ones we saw. These ones evidently never had manganese in them, but they nonetheless show, we can see if we pan to the right, we can see just how big this prismatic glass sidewalk was along this area of Broughton Street. On the northwest corner of Broughton and Bull, this most significant intersection along Broughton Street, we can see this rather indifferent building, the Suntrust Bank, and this is actually their parking garage for the bank that's in the background, the taller building in the background. That is the office building, the modern office building from the late 1970s, early 1980s. And what's sad is that this replaced one of the most magnificent skyscrapers in Savannah, the National Bank of Savannah, and the only one designed by a local architect, Hyman Wickover. Skyscrapers which exist in the background here on the other side of Bull. In fact, Bull Street was the significant gravitational pull at the end of each tithing block for tall buildings, both on State Street in the distance, the tall white building, and Congress Street, the tall building closer in. So there was another set of tall buildings on the left side here that were torn down in the 1970s. The building behind me across the street, now Levy Jewelers, was originally the Lerner Shops, a small boutique department store for women in the years after World War II. This building dates to the 1940s and illustrates the design technique of department stores by that period of the post-war years, of having the upper floors windowless. And this was made possible both by artificial light and especially air conditioning, which meant you had climate control inside the store, so that the store actually filled all 3 floors of this building and allowed shoppers to lose track of time. And this is a technique you can see out at the shopping malls with the anchor stores, which never have outside windows, and became a sort of a trademark of commercial architecture, more commonly of shopping malls, but here we see it even on Main Street. On the southeast corner of Bull and Broughton is a 1980s postmodern building that replaced an earlier post-war building with a big blank facade. But this is typical of the 1980s, using cheap construction, stucco, covering a different building material underneath, a very cheap material. So let's go see what that mystery cheap material is underneath. Underneath this stucco, which you can see is maybe a little more than 1/8 of an inch thick, we have here this pier that looks substantial but is hollow. And in fact, underneath the stucco, you can maybe hear you can see the styrofoam inside, and you can see more of it up there. The building currently occupied by the store 24E commemorated George Rule Joyner. You see up there at the top is the current owner, Rule Joyner's father, who had a store in this building decades earlier. Now this facade was covered over, has been exposed and restored, and up above the newer plaque we can see the original name of the builder, Charles Lamas, in 1921. So this building nicely illustrates a succession of proud owners who left their mark on the facade in terms of their names. One of the most elaborate examples of Terrazzo pavement in the recessed entrance of the store on Broughton Street is this fabulous piece of colorful terrazzo with green and red and yellow, forming this very modernistic pattern, somewhat abstract, geometric, typical of the early to mid 20th century. And we can see that it was for men's quality shop and is currently the entrance to 24E. So we've come in a little closer to the Globe Shoe Company, and we can see at the ground floor that it has this complex geometry, and we'll take a closer look at that in just a minute. But from here we can also see the transformation of this enormous and complex recessed entrance that in the 20th, probably in the 1950s, so this is a 1920s Art Deco design, but in the post-war years, probably in the 50s, that second floor was filled in. And so if we look up, we can see this modern Globe Shoe script, these letters, and the second floor being filled in with this translucent glass. The recessed entrance at the Globe Shoe Company is probably the most elaborate of all the recessed entrances on Broughton Street, and illustrates with its shifting geometry of the recessed area, reflects 1920s sensibility with the kind of complex geometry of Art Deco. The floor is an intricate pattern of terrazzo, forming almost like a Broadway boogie-woogie Mondrian painting effect. But the shoe store inscription is actually quite classical in character. And we can see here 2 entrances and a central display case with entrances on both sides. So this was quite uncommon and more elaborate, obviously more expensive, and gave more display case area. So not only do we have these long display cases on the side, but we have this central one. And then above all of this, where I'm standing is the leading edge of this canopy where the recess rose up 2 stories. And we can see above our head here the Native American kind of motifs that were borrowed in the design of this space. So we have Art Deco, we have sort of modern geometry, and up here we see Native American sunburst and diamond patterns as if drawn from, say, the kind of designs one would see in Native American art. One of the very cool features of the Globe Shoe Company is the pair of etched glass doors that provide access to these lateral display cases. And the door you can see at the far left has the stepped profile and pointed top of an Art Deco skyscraper, the kind of features typical of Art Deco. So stylized nature motifs and the geometry, the zigzagging, triangular geometry of the diamonds and lines moving up. Inside the central display case, we can see beautiful etched glass at the top back of that central area. And here we see the chevron and decorative features of classic Art Deco ornament. A less common feature of commercial main streets, though certainly something one can find on them, is to have a hotel. But this is a rare survivor. This is a mid-19th century hotel called the Marshall House that operated until the mid-20th century, and then it closed. It didn't modernize sufficiently, and it couldn't compete with the modern hotels out in the suburbs or things like the DeSoto Hilton here in Savannah. But by the late 20th century, it was rediscovered and restored as a more historic boutique inn that took advantage of the tourist industry. And as part of that restoration, that elaborate iron porch that you see on the facade was reproduced. So it had been, like so much of Broughton Street, cut off. And believe it or not, this whole facade was blanked out with a coating of cement or stucco. So when they restored it, they pulled all that off, revealed the windows, and recreated the elaborate iron porch based on historic photos. Another good example of this process of covering facades over modern facades that were completely blank on top of historic earlier facades is this set behind me, where the right-hand half were recently revealed and the elaborate window work there was restored, but the left-hand half, the darker gray area, is still blank. And it illustrates just how profound was this shift away from architectural detail and ornament in the post-war years, and how modern architecture brought a significant change to the look of many main streets. Another characteristic of commercial main streets is to have movie theaters on them. And we have two survivors here, at least marquees of two survivors. The SCAD Theater, former Weiss Theater, is still a functioning theater, movie theater, erected in the 1940s. And the former Avon Theater here is only a survivor in terms of its marquee. The theater was in behind, on a block behind, connected to this building by a narrow neck. And then that was torn down and the neck became a theater, and eventually that went out of business, and the marquee and the space behind is now a tap house. But it's a wonderful survivor of when this was the theater district. The Savannah Tap House is a great example, the former Avon Theater, of Art Deco design, and with its vertical stripes and recessed lighting and somewhat abstracted facade. And underneath the marquee, down here on the sidewalk, we can see a little sliver of terrazzo pavement that survives. A rare example of terrazzo that extends out into the public sidewalk, and although more common underneath the theater marquees of cities like Los Angeles, but even in Savannah at the Savannah Theater, we also see this association of terrazzo pavement with movie theater entrances. From the corner of Broughton and Abercorn, we can see two surviving theaters, the SCAD former Weiss Theater on Broughton proper, and the Lucas Theater on Abercorn, although highly visible from Broughton, with its facade facing west to Abercorn. At the corner of Abercorn and Broughton Street, we have the greatest concentration of post-war modern buildings in the Broughton Street corridor. And we have two great examples of department store buildings. The Woolworths building behind me, designed by Levy and Clark in the late 1940s, and you can see these horizontal ribbon windows. There used to be a canopy and a vertical blade sign that was part of this design, as well as a wonderful terrazzo inside the entrance that tells you that this was Woolworths. At the corner of the old Woolworth store, at the corner entrance, we can see this dramatic Art Deco style terrazzo pavement that led you in from either side and immediately let the pedestrian know what the store was. And if we pan to the left, we will see across the street this example of another department store, the Moss Brothers store, where the windows are largely cut out and covered over, even though the right-hand 2/5 of the building is actually an older building. And if you ever get inside, look through the ceiling grille and you can see the wooden structure of this building. The farther 3/5 of the building is modern reinforced concrete and had escalators and was part of the reconditioning or reworking of this whole building into one unified department store. So this was, as far as I know, the first example of escalators in Savannah. Department stores were a modern kind of technology, and they called it a moto stair, and it actually drew the attention of the newspapers. So these two buildings, this one also by Levy and Clark, has its canopy still intact, and the blade sign, which is obviously changed to show the Gen Library today. One of the most modernistic buildings on Broughton Street is the former First Federal Savings and Loan Association Bank building that you see on the northwest corner of Broughton and Abercorn. The building, built as a bank, illustrates the post-war shift of bank architecture away from the classical temple-like quality it has, as we saw on Johnson Square, towards this more transparent, especially on the ground floor where the banking hall is. And in fact, from that first floor, we can see the safe down below, just inside the windows. A technique used from the manufacturer's Hanover Bank on Fifth Avenue, New York City, from the late 1940s. The building before us here originally had louvers on the upper floors inside those projecting concrete frames, and those louvers would track with the sun and could either admit light or shade depending on the season and the time of the day. It was a highly modernistic building. It reflected the influence of the international style and specifically certain Bauhaus aspects of that style, and brought a decided modernity along with the other buildings by Levy and Kiley at this end of the street. So the Trustees Theatre on the left and the Gen Library on the right anchor the active part of Broughton Street, but there's still some more blocks farther to the east that await financial investment and revitalization. There are a few outlier stores down there, but as you can see just beyond the Gen Library, there are parking lots. There's a car dealership down there that is planning to move out. So I look forward in the future to extending this tour farther east. But for the time being, we're going to close here, and this concludes our analysis and tour of Broughton Street as a representative commercial high street or main street in North American cities.